Sounds like I just got Good morning. Good morning and welcome. My name is Monica Meisey. Most of you know me as the short person who usually almost knocks everyone down in the hallway. Vice President of Institutional Advancement. But today I am very happy to be here as an alum of Sacred Heart. So I was invited, as a few alum were, to participate in the Dehon lecture. I'm a 2020 graduate of Sacred Heart's Cor Unum program, the master's program for laity, which we got to study quite a bit about the intersection of science and faith. I'm going to hear a lot more about that today. So I will serve as your MC, and the first thing I want to do is give you just a quick word about the Dehon lecture. It's named after the founder of the Priests of the Sacred Heart, Venerable Leo John Dehon. They're also called SCJs, after the Latin initials of their names, or Dehonians. We are an apostolate of the SCJs, and we are incredibly grateful for their support. I would also like to take a moment and invite our President Rector, Father Raul Gomez Ruiz, up for our opening prayer.
I too want to add my welcome to everybody. Thank you for being here. It's been a quite challenging week, as you know, with the outbreak of COVID, but hopefully the pandemic is beginning to wane, according to the statistics I'm seeing, and so that's good news. Prior to becoming President Rector 3 years ago, I made a 30-day Ignatian exercise retreat in Sydney, Australia. This was my second 30-day retreat, once when I was getting ready to do my first vows, now 40 years ago, and now just before becoming President Rector. And as a result of that retreat, I composed some prayers, knowing that I was going to be coming to Sacred Heart. And the first one that I composed is based on a prayer by Dag Hammarskjöld. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Lord Jesus, you have called us to be your presence in the world, and so to be instruments of your love and your salvation. Reign over us, you who are one of us, and in whom we live, move, and have our being. May all see you in us also. May we prepare the way for you in our surrender to your grace. May we thank you for all that you permit to happen to us. May we not forget the needs of others, and may we treat others as we wish to be treated. Amen.
The Dehon lecture gives us an opportunity to take a full day off of classes and to reflect on some broader issues significant to our church. And so today we're very fortunate to have Father James Kurzynski and Brother Guy Consolmagno here with us to talk about faith and science. This is building off of a Science and Seminaries grant that our very own Dr. Paul Munson, now Vice President of Intellectual Formation and Chief Academic Officer, was the lead professor on. And both of our guest speakers played roles in that as well. Before I invite Paul up to invite some alumni up who were part of that program, I just want to quickly outline a little bit of the day. We're going to have our keynote speaker this morning. Then we're going to have Angelus and lunch. Then we'll have our afternoon respondent, a little bit more time with Brother Guy, and some Q&A. On your chairs are a program. There's a QR code. You can focus your phone over that QR code and submit questions that way. We're also going to have 2 microphones set up for questions in the afternoon. Unfortunately for our live stream guests, the chat function is off, so we can't take questions online. But hopefully in another year, we're all going to be, or in the fall, maybe we'll all be in person again. We're going to try to fit in a book signing. Any time that you see Jenny over by the books, you can buy a book if you would like. We're going to fit the book signing around wherever talks allow. And we're just going to see how the timing goes. With that, I'd like to invite Dr. Munson up to introduce some seminarians who participated in the Science and Seminaries trip.
Thank you, Monica. So from February 27th to March 5th in 2019, in that beautiful era that we call now pre-COVID, 2 professors of Sacred Heart and 19 seminarians went to sunny Tucson, Arizona to meet Brother Guy Consolmagno. It was a dream of mine, and sort of the ulterior motive behind it was to try to get Brother Guy to come up here to Wisconsin at some point. So now I feel very successful in that agenda. Those who joined us, many of them are still here today in this audience, and so I'd like to recognize them. Those who met Brother Guy in Arizona, who was very generous with his time, showed us around the Vatican Observatory, the University of Arizona. We went to Kitt Peak, to observatories there. But those here that were with us, first of all, my colleague, Dr. Stephen Shippey. Where are you? Could you please stand, Stephen? And then also several seminarians and priests now of the Archdiocese. Father Jordan Berghaus came with us. Matthew Bovey, who can't be with us today because he's sick, unfortunately. We hope he gets well. Matthew Furch came with us. Tony Kiza, where are you, Tony? Tony came with us. Father Patrick Magner, who I'll introduce in just a little bit here. Ariel, or Zoko. Hong Pham, priest of the Sacred Heart. There we. And then Pedro Ruiz. Hello? There we go. Good to see you, Pedro. And then Father Edward Sanchez. We'll hear from him in a little bit here. So these men went with us. I trusted them, they trusted us. And I want to thank you, gentlemen, very much for those memories 2 years ago. So you can go ahead and sit down. I've embarrassed you long enough. So I've asked 2 of these gentlemen and 2 alumni of this institution to briefly share with us sort of what that Arizona pilgrimage, the science pilgrimage as we called it, what that meant for their vocation and for their priestly ministry. And so I first have asked Father Patrick Magner, associate professor, that's just my guild, associate pastor at St. Alphonsus in Greendale, to briefly offer sort of his experience, and then I'll introduce another alum. So please, Father.
All right, good morning. As Dr. Munson said, my name is Father Patrick Magner. I am the associate pastor at St. Alphonsus in Greendale. And yeah, I just wanted to share a little bit about my experience kind of after the science pilgrimage. I think for those who had the experience through the pilgrimage, it was a very formative experience, understanding how faith and science work together. And I'm the associate pastor at St. Alphonsus. We have a big school. And one of the things I realized very quickly in my interactions with the students, in particular with the middle school students, is that there's a big pastoral issue in maybe a misunderstanding of how faith and science work together. What I saw in our student body was many students struggling with the perceived conflict between faith and science. I would go into a classroom and inevitably the kids would ask a question, how can we believe in God if we have the Big Bang Theory? How can we believe in a God who creates in 7 days if science says otherwise? And behind those questions was a real sense of struggle, right? A sense of struggle of faith. And I also had a number of parents reach out to me and sit down with their kids and talk to them because they're having a crisis of faith. And behind that crisis, again, was this faith and science issue. So in our parish, kind of equipped with what I've learned from the pilgrimage, we've been able to kind of address this pastoral issue. We've incorporated in the middle school a course that's taught by a priest that talks about the dialogue between faith and science, and to also talk about how the church has contributed to faith and science. And it's been really powerful to look into those middle schoolers' eyes. And when you say that it was a Catholic priest that formulated the Big Bang Theory, and see their minds explode, right? A man who prays, who says mass, who reads scripture, yet is on the forefront of science. It answers that pastoral tension they have in their hearts. So we've been able to do that. We've also been able to offer in-service to our teachers in the school so that they can better help the students appreciate that relationship between faith and science. And then we've also offered a formation for the parish as a whole for people to come to appreciate that relationship and that dialogue. And so I am grateful to Sacred Heart for having that experience so that I, as a priest, could answer that pastoral need of my people and draw people closer to the heart of Jesus. Thank you.
Thank you, Father. You can see why I asked him to speak. Next, and certainly not least, we have to introduce our lecturer for this morning, Father Edward Sanchez. And Father Edward is associate pastor at Holy Family up in West Bend. So Father Edward, please.
Thanks, Dr. Munson. Sure. So I'm up in Fond du Lac, actually, where they don't have COVID. So as Dr. Munson said, my name is Father Edward Sanchez, associate pastor at Holy Family in Fond du Lac. And it's also a joy to be here with you in this institution where I graduated from as an alumnus of Sacred Heart and of St. Francis de Sales. As I look back on the time there with in Arizona with Brother Guy and with the speakers there, I think about the experience of God in nature. And so when I talk to people in Fond du Lac, right, and I ask them, so where do you experience God? 9 times out of 10, they tell me, well, Father, I experience God in nature, right? You know, in the deer stand, on the lake, you know. I'm always waiting for them to say, like in prayer, right? Or like in the Mass, or in Father Edward's homilies, right? I'm still waiting. They experience God in nature. And I was kind of like bothered by this for a little bit. I was like, why is this? And then I thought about a couple of things. The first is the line that we say in the Creed every Sunday. Like, through him all things were made. Through him all things were made. That when they're experiencing the things that are made, they're experiencing the things that were made through Jesus. And when you look into the eyes of Jesus, you look into the eyes of the one through whom all these things were made. And so we should expect, in a sense, to experience God in this nature that was made through Christ. And then I remember a quote. I don't know if this is the exact quote from Brother Guy from a talk that he gave while we were there in Arizona. Because someone was like, well, Brother Guy, what's science for you and stuff? And he was like, okay. He described like seeing this father playing like hide and seek or something with his kids. And he was like, well, that's science for me. He's like, well, what do you mean? And he was like, it's this game of revealing and then hiding, of like disclosing and then obscuring. It's this game of hide and seek. And he said, for me, science is a game that God plays with me. This game of revelation and of disclosing, this game of constant discovery of the one through whom all things were made. I always remembered that as like this very personal way of understanding nature, this very personal way of understanding science. But in the end, it's about understanding Christ and his mind through whom all things were made. So it's a privilege to be here to introduce Brother Guy to you and to share a little bit of his background. So Brother Guy Consolmagno was a Jesuit and the director of the Vatican Observatory and president of the Vatican Observatory Foundation. He's from Detroit, Michigan, and his academic credentials are not lacking. He earned undergraduate and master's degrees from MIT and a PhD in planetary science from the University of Arizona. He was a postdoctoral research fellow at Harvard and MIT. He served in the U.S. Peace Corps in Kenya and taught university physics at Lafayette College before entering the Jesuits in 1989. At the Vatican Observatory since 1993, his research has explored connections between meteorites, asteroids, and the evolution of small solar system bodies, observing Kuiper Belt objects with the Vatican's 1.8 meter telescope in Arizona. And by the way, there's no way I'd be able to pronounce Kuiper Belt, K-U-I-P-E-R, if I hadn't gone to the Science and Pilgrim. It's like, I'd be very confused right now. So he's been observing Kuiper Belt objects with this huge telescope and applying his measure of meteorite physical properties to understanding asteroid origins and structure. Along with more than 200 scientific publications, he's the author of a number of popular books, including Turn Left at Orion with Dan Davis and Would You Baptize an Extraterrestrial with Paul Mueller. He also has hosted science programs for BBC Radio 4, been interviewed in numerous documentary films, appeared on the Colbert Report, and for nearly 20 years has written a monthly science column for the British Catholic magazine, The Tablet. Dr. Consolmagno's work has taken him to every continent on Earth. He collected meteorites with the NASA team on the blue ice regions of East Antarctica. He serves on numerous significant task groups, including as the chair of the Mars Task Group on the International Astronomical Union's Working Group on Planetary System Nomenclature. He has an asteroid named after him in recognition of his work. And in 2014, he received the Carl Sagan Medal from the American Astronomical Society Division for Planetary Sciences for excellence in public communication in planetary sciences. In 2015, Pope Francis appointed Dr. Consolmagno as director of the Vatican Observatory, and as such, he serves as an ex officio member of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. So it's my pleasure to be able to introduce to you and welcome to the podium Brother Guy Consolmagno.
Thank you very much. Whenever I hear that introduction, which I wrote, I think to myself, that's a heck of a guy. I'd like to meet him someday. Because it sure isn't the hell I see in the mirror in the morning. I have pretty pictures, because anybody who invites an astronomer should, expect to see pretty pictures. If you can't see the pictures, don't worry about them. The material here is actually in the text itself. And first of all, I want to thank you for inviting me. I want to thank everybody who, treated me so marvelously here. And especially thanks for coming to Wisconsin. Because as you heard, I grew up in Detroit. I grew up in Michigan. I did my philosophy studies as a Jesuit in Chicago. And so to come back here to the Midwest from Tucson, which is where I originally came from, or Rome, where I was a few months ago, it really is coming home. And it was in Chicago about 30 years ago that I first met this woman, a wonderful friend of mine. I'll call her Nancy. At the time, she was a single mom with a teenage daughter, Julie, who had this very lively interest in astronomy. And she once did a report for her school about things she had learned from the Vatican astronomer, and her teacher failed her because there's no such thing as a Vatican astronomer. You're making this all up. Over the years, I got to see Julie grow up. She entered a career in medical technology. She married this sweet guy, we'll call him Michael. She started her own family. She's got 2 daughters today, age 10 and 13. They remind me of their mom when she was that age. And my friend Nancy sends me regular updates, of grandkid stories. Over the Christmas holidays, those girls were spending their free time at the hospital up in Marquette, reading to their father, there's Marquette, Michigan, reading to their father, Michael, as he was drifting in and out of a coma. And last month in January, he died. It was COVID. Among the last things he said to his daughters, he apologized. He'd not been vaccinated. It's a story that's played out all over the world for the last 2 years, millions of times. And the refusal of really good and really smart people to get the vaccine is one of those especially tragic parts of those stories. I've seen the phrase, follow the science. It's been a rallying cry of people trying to get people to use the vaccine. As a rallying cry, it's not working. And I think it's interesting to think about why. You can find vaccine skeptics across all populations, all demographics, but it's an attitude that's especially strong among certain religious groups. Writing in the New York Times, the Anglican priest Tish Harrison Warren suggested that this split is evidence of a more general division in our culture between science and religion. She writes, "These past 2 years have exposed how the science versus faith discourse isn't an abstract ideological debate, but a false dichotomy that has disastrous real-world consequences." Her insight comes out of research that shows that the evangelical Christians in the United States are among the populations that are the least vaccinated against the coronavirus, but the implication is that a distrust of science in that community is reflected in their distrust of the vaccines, and that's tied to this perceived need to choose between faith and science. But of course, you can find that distrust in lots of religious groups, well beyond the evangelicals. There are a large number of Catholics who have similar views. Even in the face of very strong urgings from the Vatican and from Pope Francis himself, that vaccination is not only a moral way to protect your life and the lives of people who love you and depend on you, it's an essential step in safeguarding the health and safety of the larger community. Getting vaccinated at the Vatican is not just something that's encouraged, it's the law. As of January 31st, if you're not vaccinated and you work for the Vatican, they're stopping your paychecks. You can't set foot on Vatican territory without a green pass that says you've been vaccinated or at least tested in the last 48 hours. To refuse vaccination on personal grounds, obviously there are exceptions if you've got a medical reason why you can't, that's seen as the sin of pride. After reading that New York Times commentary, responding to questions about it on an America Magazine podcast, I wrote a lengthy and fairly scholarly article on the topic of COVID and vaccines and the science denial for Civiltà Cattolica, which is an Italian Jesuit magazine. As you may know, everything published in Civiltà Cattolica is approved by the Vatican before it can be published. And my article came out last month. The response to the article is kind of interesting. For one thing, I learned how subtle errors in translation can lead to pretty serious misreadings. My original submission was written in English, and in it I examined and took exception to that phrase, follow the science, which in the Italian became fidati della scienza, which in turn got retranslated by the commentariat back into English as trust the science. And each of those translations is a correct translation, but there's a world of difference between trust and follow. The picture, in case those of you who can't see it, is a picture of Jesus saying to his disciples, I'm not talking about following me on Twitter, I'm talking about following me, period. The problem is the difference between trusting and following. I have no trouble trusting science, I'm a scientist. But what I worry about in the phrase follow is that a person of faith can hear that follow the science as a challenge to the invitation of Jesus to follow me, as a rival answer to Peter's plaint in John's Gospel, Lord, to whom shall we go? If you hear it that way, the vaccine and science in general becomes set up as a substitute for Jesus. So when the argument becomes one of trusting instead of following, you lose that subtlety. And ironically, the working title of my article in Italian was Seguire la scienza, which is follow the science. But the translator realized follow in that sense doesn't have the same significance to an Italian audience. Anyway, another revealing insight I got from reading the commentaries was how each side of the vaccine debates, which is to say each side of the political debates nowadays, either quotes me saying just the things that they agree with, or quotes me and argues about me saying the things I actually was very careful not to say. We're all too used to hearing either the things we want to hear or the things we're afraid of hearing, rather than hearing what's actually being said. We're all afraid of being challenged. And in all of the posturing and point scoring and the debates that go on, the deaths of people like my friend's son-in-law, Michael, and the broken lives of the family that result get lost in the shuffle. Also lost in the shuffle was the original point I was trying to make, which has nothing to do, frankly, with COVID. When I wrote these ideas, my theme was not about vaccine skepticism or COVID health tips. I only brought those up as examples that we have all experienced recently to illustrate an issue that was around long before COVID, like the trip that these guys took to Arizona, and is going to be around long after COVID is forgotten, just as most people forgot the flu pandemic of 100 years ago. Because I'm not a medical expert. I'm not an expert in social psychology. I'm not an expert in moral theology, or as one of my teachers once said, I am not a moral theologian. Oh dear. I'm an astronomer. I do astronomy. I teach astronomy. I do have some experience in the misunderstanding in the general public of what it is we're trying to do in our labs and at our telescopes. You know, people always ask me, what's the latest? And I think, you want to know the latest? The latest is the stuff that's probably wrong. We don't know yet. That's why it's exciting. The dichotomy between faith and science and faith and religion has implications way beyond vaccine skepticism. It comes out of a false view of what science is and what science can promise. And you find this misunderstanding among those who are skeptical of the science, okay, but what I find is more dangerous is you find this misunderstanding in the people who think they're supporting the science, in the people who come up with that phrase, trust or follow the science. Their version of the sin of pride is when they feel superior to anyone who is so stupid as to question the vaccine. There's pride for you as well. In other words, the people I'm talking to here today are not those of you who are skeptical of the vaccines. I'm not going to reach you. I'm not going to make you change your mind. I know that, and do what you need to do. The people I want to reach are the ones who think they agree with me, because I want to challenge you. Skepticism of the vaccine comes a lot of times from political or social motivations. For some people, it's a tribal marker. It's a way of saying, I'm one of these people, not one of those people. When you tie your acceptance of the vaccine to your acceptance of science in general, then you make science a tribal marker, and that doesn't do science any good. We don't want science to be just the realm of one political party or one science or one religion for that matter. That's not what science should be. That's not what knowledge should be. I think this will make us reconsider how we present the argument in favor of science beyond just, promoting vaccines. It can also force us to take a closer look at how we are tempted to use science, just as some people are tempted to use faith, as a bulwark against our fundamental human fear of uncertainty. I speak as the director of the Vatican Observatory. I'm a scientist and an official within the Catholic Church. I'm well familiar with both scientific and clerical authority and people who are skeptical of scientific or clerical authority. To treat scientists as if they're a member of a kind of priesthood of truth is pretty questionable, especially when the real priests are under attack in our society right now. And, okay, I'm all in favor of vaccinations, but that wording of the phrase follow the science is emblematic of a common conception of science that's misleading and which leaves science open to attack, because it carries not only the idea that science is trustworthy, it suggests that science is the only trustworthy guide to the truth. And the idea that science is the only trustworthy guide to the truth implies that the authority of science is infallible. Okay, so we've got a scientist here in this picture in my lab. He came with his own white lab coat. The curious thing about papal infallibility is how absolutely limited it is. I say of all the bosses I had in the scientific world, he's the only one who will admit that his infallibility has limits. Anyone who's actually familiar with science knows that science is not infallible. When science fails to live up to this exaggerated sense of reliability, that failure only feeds further skepticism. Yeah, the vaccine prevents the disease for an overwhelming majority of the vaccinated. It reduces the severity of the disease even when you get the breakthrough cases, but it's not perfect. Fully vaccinated people can and do come down with COVID, sometimes with serious effects. To the vaccine skeptic, the fact that these failures happen at all suggests not only that the vaccine isn't perfect, but that they're right in thinking follow the science can be dangerous. And as far as that goes, they've got a point. As much as we hate to admit it, fear of a blind trust in science has more than an element of truth behind it. Sometimes the science is very wrong indeed. I'm a scientist. I can name any number of those 200 scientific papers you heard about that I've written over my career that have turned out to be embarrassingly incorrect. But beyond the occasional mistakes, even the most notable advances in science have been associated with fundamental errors that eventually had to be corrected. Fundamental assumptions that turned out to be false or at least incomplete. Results that are going to be needed to be refined and perfected. Galileo taught that the Earth spins and moves around the sun, and he was right. But his arguments at that time fell far short of being convincing proofs, and in some cases, like his arguments on the tides, he was completely wrong. His proofs didn't work, even though, ultimately his idea was right. James Clerk Maxwell developed this remarkable theory of the electromagnetic field, and he did it by assuming that electromagnetic waves are carried by a compressible ether. And one of the results of his theory is to show that, in fact, there's no such thing as an ether. Ernst Mach developed a mathematical description of shock waves that led to our understanding of faster than sound travel, Mach numbers you probably have heard of. Mach took Maxwell's ideas of fields as the basis of a novel new theory of matter that did away with atoms. We now know that actually atoms are true and his theory isn't. Edwin Hubble observed the motions of galaxy clusters, which has been hailed as confirmation of the Big Bang cosmology. Hubble himself never accepted the idea of the Big Bang. Medicine is never perfect. Practitioners of medicine, even less so. There are financial incentives for approving new drugs that warp even the most careful system of safety approval. There are thousands of adults today who still carry birth defects caused by thalidomide, which was thought to be a safe aid for morning sickness and prescribed to pregnant women in the 1960s until they started having babies with birth defects. Most of us here in America were spared to it because the FDA did not approve it. But you'll still find women like in the picture here who were born in the 60s throughout Europe. Vaccines do not have a perfect history. As we mentioned, even the COVID vaccines allow breakthrough infections. Side effects to the vaccination are common. They can vary in severity from case to case. Safety as well as efficacy are issues that require a long period of study before approving the vaccine. And even with that lengthy process, mistakes can and do happen. It's almost certain that the time will come when the worst fears of the anti-vaccine community are going to be shown to become true. Even worse for science, there are times in our history when the science, or at least how we perceive the science in the general public, have turned out to be not merely imperfect, not merely incorrect, but horrifyingly bad. Think of how science was promoted in the late 18th or the late 19th, early 20th centuries. You had popularizers like H.G. Wells. You had actual scientists like Alexander Graham Bell, who founded the American Association for the Advancement of Science. You had legal experts who were making legal decisions based on the best science of the day, like the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes. What these three men had in common was that they all promoted the idea of eugenics. They insisted that we could perfect the human race by eliminating inferior people. It was an idea that was so self-evident to them that anyone, like the church, who opposed it on moral grounds was seen as dangerously backwards. You remember the Scopes trial, the famous one that's immortalized in Inherit the Wind? There was this high school biology teacher, John Scopes, was put on trial for teaching evolution. What all the dramas leave out is that the evolution textbook that he used also supported eugenics. It claimed, falsely, that evolution explained the so-called natural superiority of certain races, guess which ones, certain nationalities, guess which ones. Using eugenics as its rationale, in 1924, the U.S. Congress passed an immigration law that would stop people like my grandfather from coming to America. The quotas meant that the immigration of Italians into America after 1924 dropped by 90%. Of course, all Asians were banned as well. The law passed with overwhelming support, liberals and conservatives both. As a result of the popular acceptance of eugenics, it's estimated that 70,000 women, mostly minorities, were forcibly sterilized in the United States in the 20th century, up into the 1970s. And of course, eugenics was the logic behind the Nazi death camps. Because popular science had been so wrong, does it logically follow that science itself should never be trusted? Obviously not. For one thing, the science did eventually get it right. Eugenics had actually been long discredited in scientific circles well before the effects of the laws were finally reversed. And of course, even if the science had been right, it still would have been immoral. You can argue that the villains in the piece were the popularizers. They succumbed to the temptation of promoting this oversimplified view of science. That doesn't excuse the scientists who got it wrong in the first place. But the issue is deeper than that. The fight over follow the science is really a fight over the reliability of authority in general. At the end of the day, both those who promote science and those who disdain science are looking for certainty. But it's an uncertain universe. It's an almost Calvinistic intolerance of error. We yearn for a world of black and white where failure is not an option. And the irony is that real science itself is based on doubt and error, and learning how to analyze them, and learning how to learn from our error. It's essential to know that you don't know. Knowing your ignorance is what motivates you to do the work to know things better, to not be satisfied with what you've already got. In science, failure isn't an option, it's a requirement. Science is not merely sometimes incomplete, it is by design always incomplete. It's precisely when the scientific work is done correctly and it advances the field that it becomes obsolete. A sign of a successful piece of science is that it pushes the field beyond the understanding that was there when you started the work. Once the scientific knowledge is advanced, the original work is obsolete, no longer current. Science is in the business of making itself obsolete, which is why the best science of the day is such a stupid thing to base your religion on. Science is very different from philosophy or theology. You can study philosophy by reading your grandfather's copy of the works of Aristotle. You would never study biology by using your grandfather's biology textbook. They are different kinds of knowledge. This need to be open to mistakes is a lesson that goes beyond the world of science. I'll give you a trivial example. When I was a student at MIT, I was on the sailing team. I would race on the Charles River, which in those days was horribly polluted, so if you capsized, you had to get a tetanus shot. I'm not making that up. I never once capsized. I also never won a race. And the two are connected. I never pushed my little dinghy to find the limits of how far and how fast I could go. Learning to fail is difficult. It requires gauging the impossible balance of figuring out when do you keep pushing at an idea that, maybe just with a little more work I can make it work. And knowing when it's time to admit you're wrong, time to look for a different answer. Hubble resisted the idea of an expanding universe. He was wrong. Ludwig Boltzmann resisted the idea from Mach that there are no atoms. Boltzmann was right. New is neither necessarily right nor necessarily wrong. But as any poker player can tell you, there's no simple calculus that can make the decision for you about when to hold and when to fold. And the problem isn't even one as simple of just, if we have more data, we'll be able to make the decision. The issue may well be that the idea in question requires a complete change in the way you understand the data. Science isn't just a description of the universe. No matter how accurate your description is, it's also a quest to understand why things happen the way they do. To be able to get the right answer, to predict what's going to happen next, that's not the goal. That's merely the test to see whether your level of understanding is good enough. Give you an example. Ptolemy had an idea of how to describe the motions of the planets in the sky. Kepler had a different way of describing the motions of the planets in the sky. Ptolemy, from the year 150 AD, said that planets move in circles around the Earth, but within each circle there was a separate circle to allow for the slightly different motion than what a simple circle would give you. And if that didn't work, you just add another small circle. And if you keep adding an infinite number of circles, eventually you can match the path of any planet, or anything else for that matter. Those of you who have studied a little bit of math will recognize it as the Fourier series. Kepler had the idea that you could describe the motion of a planet if you assumed it went around the sun, not the Earth, and the path was an ellipse. The trouble is, because the planets perturb each other, the ellipse is only an approximation. If Kepler had had one more decimal point of precision in his data, he would have rejected ellipses because they didn't work at that point. Why do we accept Kepler's ellipses and teach them rather than Ptolemy's infinite number of circles? Well, besides the fact that it's simpler, even if it's not quite right, Ptolemy's calculations were sterile. They didn't lead to any deeper insight into the nature of the planets and the way they move. Ptolemy probably never even asked that question. Kepler's ellipses, on the other hand, are what helped Isaac Newton come up with the law of gravity. The science fiction writer and science popularizer Isaac Asimov, I think, put it really well. He says, the most exciting thing you hear in the lab is not, Eureka, I found it! Instead, it's, huh, that's funny. You only become a scientist when you're able to look at something you thought you understood and go, maybe that's not right. Until you can do that, you won't even know to look for what's going wrong. Sadly, though, that's not how we teach science. In the introductory courses, at least, and most of us never get past the introductory courses, success in your science class means that you're able to get the answers in the back of the book. Doing these rote problems is probably the fastest way to immerse yourself into a sense of what science and success feels like. You have to learn how to play the scales before you can play the music. But scales aren't music. Getting the answers is not science. The difficulty is that accepting such uncertainty also means accepting the risk that comes from attempting the uncertain. You can't win races without risking a capsize, but to capsize is a real and unpleasant and non-negligible risk. There is a parallel role that doubt plays in faith. The popular religious writer Anne Lamott, in her book Plan B, Further Thoughts on Faith, came up with a marvelous phrase, the opposite of faith is not doubt, the opposite of faith is certainty. Think about that. If we didn't have doubts, we wouldn't need faith. But it's also the case that, like in science, doubt is the essential driver that makes us keep looking for God, not being satisfied with accepting what we learned from the nuns when we were 5 years old. Not being satisfied with just accepting or rejecting whatever religious authority tells us. Paul Tillich wrote in his book, Dynamics of Faith, that the role of doubt in faith is, and I'll quote, the doubt which accompanies every risk, not the permanent doubt of the scientist, not the transitory doubt of the skeptic, but the doubt of him who is ultimately concerned about a concrete content. You can call it an existential doubt. It is aware of the element of uncertainty in every existential truth. And he goes on to say, serious doubt is confirmation of faith. It indicates the seriousness of the concern, of its unconditional character. If you think you got God, why are you still here studying? If you think you're going to have God when they ordain you, we've got some people here who will tell you otherwise. Accepting doubt, accepting the inevitability of error, also means accepting a tolerance for other people even when they've been wrong. I still enjoy the stories of H.G. Wells. I still admire a lot that Oliver Wendell Holmes did as a Chief Justice. I still use Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, even though I abhor their views on eugenics. I can accept that heroes are sometimes sinners, even serious sinners. And maybe someday I'll even get to the point of accepting that maybe sometimes I'm a sinner too. Religion does not give a certain formula that guarantees salvation. That's what we would call casuistry. It implies a salvation that could be earned by your own behavior, by following a formula, by following a calculus of right and wrong, rather than salvation as which is received as the unearned gift of a loving God. What religion can do is to teach us about the gift that's been offered and give us a way where we can express our acceptance of that gift. Science does not give perfect truth. Ever refined experiments or theories can result in a more precise description of nature, but an essential lesson that every student of science learns is the difference between precision and accuracy. You can have a really precise measurement using a really careful measurement of a yardstick, but the yardstick itself could be wrong. It could be very precise, but systematically inaccurate. No yardstick is perfect. No matter how good our science is, it will always be subject not only to the systematic inaccuracies of the instruments, but also our human tendencies to force the data to fit our preconceptions. You've heard the joke about the physicist who wants to prove that all odd numbers are prime. 3 is prime, 5 is prime, 7 is prime, 9 must be experimental error, 11 is prime. Any understanding that thinks of itself as perfect is dead. It will never seek to understand further. But science does provide insights into how to see and how to recognize truth. It can tell you the odds of success for a given formulation of the truth. We trust the vaccine not because it's perfect, but because it does improve your odds of not getting sick. The long-term effects of the vaccine can't be known until we've had a long term with them. The short-term effects of not getting the vaccine we know too well. Especially my friends, Nancy and Julie, Michael's children. Seeing how doubt plays an essential role in both science and faith, you can appreciate that science and faith can only seem to be in conflict if you neglect the role of uncertainty in each of them. You can only see them in conflict if you think of them as two sets of closed books of rules, books of facts, each demanding infallible credulity and infallible and unshaking understanding. But certainty is not religion, it's fanaticism. And certainty is not science, it's scientism. A certain kind of skepticism has been a hallmark of science since its beginnings in the 20th century. Galileo is a hero of modern science and the scientific method, and rightly so, because he expressed this principle in his book, The Assayer, his treatise on the philosophy of science, that the evidence of observation and experiment counts more than any sage pronouncements from the authority of the ages. Of course, one of the ironic insights of a recent biography of Galileo by H.L. Hilbrun is why the famous scientist was so resistant to authority. Hilbrun argues that Galileo rejected authority precisely on the authority of his father and his teachers. Galileo was a rebel against what was being taught because that's what he was taught to be. Rebellion is a common behavior in adolescents who are testing and defining the boundaries of their autonomy. I remember when I was a kid, people would wear these buttons that said, "Question authority," and I always go, "Question authority? Says who?" There is a further irony, though, and you see this in the vaccine skeptics. After they announce they're too clever to be fooled by the experts, they start self-dosing with these horribly inappropriate and dangerous drugs that they read about on the internet. I'm not the first one to point out that the very people who are saying, "Don't be sheep," started using drugs that were designed for sheep. How does this happen? Why would anybody trust their lives to something they found on the internet? Why would we reject organized religion in favor of a philosophy that you could fit on a bumper sticker or a t-shirt? In our society, skepticism of authority runs alongside the desire for certainty. The two desires are, of course, antithetical. You can't at the same time demand perfect truth while also rejecting any entity that has the authority to bring you to a better truth. What results is that our brains are faced with these two diametrically opposed desires, and we wind up, squirting off sideways somehow. We reject the officially sanctioned authority in favor of a secret source of knowledge available only to a hidden few. And even though something you find on a web page is actually, by definition, available to the entire world of the internet, the experience of discovering it by yourself on your own personal computer with the shades down in your own little room makes it feel like this is a private and hidden discovery, one which by its hidden nature has value beyond what the rest of the hoi polloi seem to think of. Recognize the temptation? It's called Gnosticism. It's a desire to embrace secret knowledge. It's an urge that was, around at the time of the church fathers in the 2nd century, the 1st century. You found it in the esoteric Eleusinian rites of ancient Greece. It is the source of, I'll tell you, secret knowledge that God doesn't want you to have. That was the temptation of the snake in the garden. It's instructive to see how this desire for secret knowledge manifests itself, even among those you might think are highly knowledgeable already. Scientists, for instance, I speak as one. Engineers, like a lot of my classmates at MIT. We're particularly tempted to think of ourselves as smarter than the rest of the world, and all too often we can be confident to the point of arrogance about our intellectual ability, our ability to work things out in ourselves. I'm really trained in my own work. I can do things that most of you guys can't do. Therefore, since I'm better than you in astronomy, I'm probably better than you in everything else as well. Look at the Cambridge physicist, Stephen Hawking, brilliant physicist. But in his popular book, he would philosophize about God and the origin of the universe, while insisting, I'm not a philosopher, as if being a physicist was better than being a philosopher. My friend Neil deGrasse Tyson, he's the American Museum of Natural History. He's an astrophysicist. He's got an opinion about nearly everything and an urge to share it all on social media, no matter how far away it is from his realm of expertise. Even more than the scientists, I find this in the engineers. Engineers are really vulnerable to this kind of sense of privilege. Scientists get their value basically if other scientists will cite their work. So you want to be sure that you're on relatively good terms with other people. An engineer's worth depends solely on the products they make. If they make a good widget, you're going to get hired, regardless of what your other opinions are. And engineers can often be surrounded at their work by bosses who really don't understand what it is the engineers are doing. You see that attitude in the comic strip Dilbert, which is written from the point of view of the engineer. Nobody's ever written the comic strip about the poor pointy-haired Doss who has to deal with Dilbert. Engineers are used to thinking of themselves as the smartest guy in the room, precisely because they share that room with the non-engineers, who they dismiss as, the suits. Try translating that into Italian. That didn't work at all. Since engineers are not inhibited by social pressures, they feel free to adopt beliefs that the rest of the world finds absurd, and the fact that nobody else believes those things just confirms to them the fact that they're smarter than everyone else. What's the point of being the smartest guy in the room if all you do is agree with everybody else in the room? And so with that attitude, you almost have to be a contrarian. And that makes engineers particularly easy prey for the peddlers of modern kinds of Gnosticism. UFOs, a face on Mars, faddish diets, strange religions. And if any of those ideas actually did become mainstream, they would probably abandon them at that point. And there's a particularly dangerous effect that occurs if you hold these strange beliefs, it eventually comes at a cost. Maybe you lose your social status. Maybe somebody finally says, I'm not going to hire you because, you make a good transistor, but you're a racist. In a case like that, you think you're undergoing persecution. You think you're suffering, and that suffering turns the unorthodox belief into a marker of your tribe, a marker of your self-identity. If your beliefs wind up coming at a high personal cost, then you become so invested in them that you can't ever admit you were wrong. If you're trying to convince somebody to change their mind, boy, is that the wrong way to go about doing it. Because to them, to abandon the belief that you have in favor of what everybody else thinks would make you feel like you were abandoning yourself. And the tendency can be found in scientists and engineers, but you find it in a lot of other places in our society. Our desire to maintain personal identity in the face of a hostile culture is something we actually learn from that culture. Think of your favorite athlete who says he's going to do his own research about the virus. that attitude reinforces his sense of stardom, that sense that he's superior to everybody else in the room. And you might notice the correlation that these are often the athletes who wind up, getting rid of their coaches because they don't hear what they wanted to hear from the coach. Rather than heaping scorn on people who fall prey to such urges, maybe it's worthwhile to look and see where those ideas come from. If we assume that scientists, or the author of the secret websites for that matter, deserve to be followed because they're smarter than the rest of us, then implicitly we're equating smarter with better. That's at the root of the temptations in Gnosticism. That sense that your self-worth comes from thinking you're smarter than the other guy in the room, the smartest guy in the room, smarter than the average bear. Then you've got to be the smartest guy in the room or else you're somehow inferior. Think of the unspoken assumption in this evaluation, the identification of being smarter as a marker of personal superiority. Do you find that in Scripture? Matthew chapter 11, verse 25, quotes Jesus saying, "I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you've hidden these things from the wise and the intelligent and have revealed them to infants." Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 1, verses 17 and on, insists that the wisdom of the gospel looks very different from what the world considers wise. Think of who we hold up as heroes and saints. There were a lot of very clever and learned theologians in the 19th century in Belgium and France and Germany. Most of them at each other's throats. The saints of that era who we remember today were Bernadette, Francis de Sales, Teresa Little Flower, not concerned with scoring theological debaters' points, but concerned about loving God. I'm not saying this to demean theology, to demean intelligence. I'm a professional astronomer. I live off this stuff. But it does mean that you never can equate cleverness with worth. And when I think of my fellow astronomers, I can see evidence for that in many places as well. The value of whatever intelligence or education or wisdom that we do have doesn't lie in those attributes themselves. Whatever we do has value insofar as it is a form of praise to our Creator. We all have God-given talents, whether they're academic or whether they're something else. Engaging them makes us more authentically whom God created us to be, and thus able to encounter God more fully, each in our own way. For me, astronomy happens to be the playing field where I've been given the opportunity to come to know God. Others find God in places that I could never reach. That's how we find God in all things. That's how we all do all things for the greater glory of God. So to summarize, the very uncertainty and error that medical science has been criticized for in the pandemic is actually its strength, the reason we do trust it. By correcting what we learn is wrong, we come constantly closer to the truth. Authority is always stronger when it can admit error and correct itself. Science never tells ultimate truths, it only tells you the odds. A vaccine isn't going to completely prevent disease, but it will improve your odds. Unfortunately, most of us are not very skilled at understanding the mathematics of probability, and the people who run casinos and lotteries are counting on that. But all of us are tempted by both a desire for absolute certainty and a skepticism of the very authority that could lead us to better understanding. It's impossible to both demand and reject the best knowledge of the day. That's how we're tempted to abandon the wisdom of professionals and seek hidden knowledge. The trouble comes that we teach science, at least to the level where most of us stop learning it, as a problem-solving solution. Passing the test means that you've, matched the answer key, but that's not science. any more than playing scales is music. A system of knowing science is always incomplete. Progress means making the old answer keys obsolete. And yet, at any given moment, the best science of the day is still the closest we have at the moment to finding where truth can be found. A theology professor once taught me the important insight. I don't know if you've heard this one here. Every heresy is based on an important truth. Have you heard that one? Yeah. In other words, even ideas that are ultimately incorrect gain traction because they're based on something that's true. The anti-vaxxers can point to breakthrough infections, the side effects of the vaccines, the commercial pressures, and how that warps the way the drugs are made and marketed. And each of those points is valid. They don't, by themselves, invalidate the use of vaccines. But when you come up with outlandish claims about the power of science and the power of technology, the science is going to follow the science and you'll never go wrong. Ironically, that gives credence to the people who think that there are going to be microchips or mind control drugs hidden in the vaccines. And all of that is nothing more than clever debating points. And meanwhile, my friend Nancy's granddaughters have lost their father in a death that didn't have to happen. Reflecting on that death, reflecting on my own nature of scientific work, I realized finally there's a bigger theme, more than just, science and faith. It's about love. It's about the nature of love. I love science. I love doing science, but my lifetime's resume of scientific papers includes so many that have turned out to be wrong. Doesn't mean that I don't still love the science, even though I've been wrong. I'm proud of the obsolete papers. They show me that I was in the right field, where people were interested enough to try to go beyond where I was when I started. Science is not perfect. Hurrah for science. Love doesn't demand perfection. Love admits of error, of doubt, of mistakes, both on our parts and on the parts of those we love. And as we've seen in the world of science, we cannot grow if we don't accept that we need to grow. That's the nature of love. And that's central to accepting that God loves us. Nancy's granddaughters learned the tragic lesson that their father was imperfect. He made a terrible mistake, and yet they love him and they mourn him. I'm reminded of the response to an earlier pandemic, the HIV pandemic. AIDS was popularly associated with transmission during sexual activity. The slogan then was safe sex. The logic behind the slogan made a certain sense within the context, but like all slogans, like follow the science, reality was so much more complicated. Beyond the fact that sexual activity is not the only way you could get the disease, the slogan tended to reduce the nature of sexual activity to being a vehicle for transmitting disease. There are a lot of other things that go on. It includes the transmission of psychological and emotional vulnerabilities that are at the heart of the act. Not to mention the creation of your life. Disease isn't the only thing you risk in sexual activity. Sex is an act of love, and love itself is never safe. Love is not supposed to be safe. To love another person is to open yourself to the risk of rejection and betrayal, and without that risk, the act of love becomes meaningless, and Jesus himself is our model for how to love and how to be open to the fact that you can be betrayed. Trying to understand the universe from astronomy to medicine is only possible when it is a response to love. Doing science depends on loving even the unlovable tedium of the study. Trusting even when our trust in scientific progress is uncertain. Being willing to forgive and learn even from those who have gone wrong in the past. Love means living with uncertainty, even as we try to learn to trust. So how do we learn? How do we live with the uncertainty of disease, with the fallibility of science, the fear of losing our own personal autonomy? We respond the same way we always respond to the invitation of love, with a combination of caution and boldness. When we are given the opportunity to love, we know that this love will inevitably fail at times. And we know, even if we don't want to admit it, that sometimes we're going to fail in this love relationship. We are all fallen humans. And yet, an imperfect love is still far preferable to a love with no love at all. And so we take sensible precautions. We neither reject love, nor do we rush into it blindly. Even those who have the special love that comes from a committed monogamous relationship, you still rely on a community of friends and family, including our church, to be there to support you at the moments of crisis in the relationship. That's one of the reasons we've got public ceremonies, like the exchange of vows before our friends and before our family and before God, and why they're important. It's more than just me and her. It's more than just me and my body. One of the more horrible ironies is that the people who are, saying I have autonomy and therefore I should have control over whether I get the vaccine are using the same language as the people who are promoting, choice in abortion, making the same mistake that the decision is more than just you and your body. It's the community of people around you who are affected by who you are. We know that trusting science means putting our trust in a beautiful but fallible kind of wisdom. We don't give total and blind trust to any one bit of science. Even if it was science I did myself, I know better than to trust myself. Either whether it's science that we found in the internet, I know not to trust everything I find there. Except the vaccine, okay, but also maintain social distancing. Also use appropriate hygiene. Also wear masks. Also do the other things. One of the great things of the last 2 years is that I didn't come down with the flu. I didn't come down with the horrible colds I usually got. Maybe something I should have been doing right all along. The reality of human fallibility, the consequence of original sin, is both a reason to fear and an opportunity to rejoice. We rejoice that the science, for all its flaws, does nonetheless give us better odds at living healthy lives. We rejoice that we've been given by God the capability of understanding and appreciating creation through our science in ever more profound ways. We rejoice that even in the face of the most serious challenges and temptations, love can triumph. And in those crisis points where we need our community, if we're lucky, we come out of them with an ever strengthened love and a deeper love. This exercise can also be a way of recognizing the same dynamics in our church. The Spirit can guide us, but we fallible human members all too often fail to heed the guidance. With every failure comes an opportunity to learn, and with every success comes the recognition that God can act through us. Precisely because no success is certain, we glory all the more at every success that does occur. Because at the end of the day, the only certain thing in life is God's love and God's mercy and our need for both. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brother Guy. A lot to think about. So I hope if you all have questions, you're jotting them down and going ahead and submit them early. That might help when we have our Q&A session to keep that running smoothly. We are almost at 11:45. So what I would ask is for the lobby to stay fairly quiet, time of reflection. We will gather here and pray. Father Raul will lead us in the Angelus at the noon bells, we will have extra Angelus cards available at the front desk if anyone needs them. So you can take a short break, but then please come back here for some quiet reflection before the Angelus. Would our speakers feel so inclined to maybe do a little book signing around 12:45 before the 1 o'clock lecture starts? All right, so we'll do that. I will say, Brother Guy, you've been a partner in evangelization with me without knowing it for many years. I give his book away to smart young confirmation candidates because it really addresses that problem where they get stuck that Father Patrick was talking about, faith and science, and they get stuck there. And now Father James's book is going to be another one of my gift-giving evangelization tools. So I recommend them both. They'll be available over there and the book signing over there. For our live stream audience, you will need to log back in using the second link that you should have received in the confirmation email. And I think we're caught up. Looking forward to Father James. Thank you to the seminarians who shared reflections as well. And we'll see you for the Angelus.